Sign it, Ethan said, sliding the papers across the reception table like they were nothing more than a dinner receipt. His voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of condolences, and I remember staring at the bold black title Diverse Agreement while the smell of cold coffee and funeral flowers clung to the air, my father's framed photo just 10 feet away, smiling in a way that made this moment feel even more unreal. "Not here," I whispered, my throat dry, fingers hovering over the pen as my aunt froze mid-step beside us, her eyes darting between my face and his, and Ethan leaned closer, his jaw tight, his breath steady, controlled. "Your dad would want you to do the right thing, Elena. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." And behind him, the woman in the black dress shifted her weight, arms crossed, watching me like I was an inconvenience she was ready to be done with. "You're doing this now?" I asked, my voice barely holding, and he shrugged slightly. Like timing didn't matter, like grief didn't matter, like I didn't matter. "It's already been decided," he said. And that's when I realized this wasn't a conversation. It was an execution. Quiet and clean, right in the middle of my father's funeral reception, and for a second, I felt every pair of eyes in that room on me, waiting, judging, expecting me to fold the way I always had, expecting me to be small, manageable, agreeable, the same woman they all thought they knew. And if you've ever felt that moment, where the ground beneath you shifts and you realize the people you trusted have already moved on without you, then you understand why I didn't cry, why I didn't argue, why I just stood there, staring at those papers, because something inside me had already started to change. And before I tell you what happened next, I just want to say this: if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a second to like, subscribe, and maybe leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now, because I've learned that the quietest stories often connect us the most. My name is Elena Rivera. I'm 34 years old, and this was the day my husband tried to erase me at my father's funeral. The day everything I thought I knew about my marriage collapsed in front of everyone who had ever mattered to me, and to understand how I ended up standing there, pen in hand, being told to sign away my life, "You need to go back with me," just a few hours earlier, before the reception, before the whispers, before Ethan decided to make his move. That morning, the sky over San Diego was a dull gray, the kind that presses down on you without rain, and I remember sitting in my car outside a small brick building, watching people walk past with their coffee cups and busy lives, completely unaware that inside, I was about to sign something that would change everything, and even then, I didn't fully understand how much, but I knew enough to feel the weight of it in my chest, the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't come from fear, but from clarity, the kind you get when you finally stop explaining yourself to people who never really listened. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, Ethan's name lighting up the screen, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. "Where are you?" he asked. His tone already edged with irritation, like I was late for something trivial, like today wasn't the day we were burying my father. "I'm on my way," I said, keeping my voice steady, and there was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to know he didn't believe me. "Don't be late," he said finally. "My parents are already there." And I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Even today was about appearances, about what his family would think, about making sure everything looked right from the outside. "I won't," I replied. And when I hung up, I looked down at the folder on the passenger seat beside me, a simple manila envelope that didn't look like much, but inside it were documents, signatures, decisions that had been building for months, maybe longer, decisions I hadn't shared with Ethan, decisions he never thought I was capable of making on my own, and that was the part that almost made this easy. The fact that he had underestimated me for so long that he didn't even consider the possibility that I might already be steps ahead. When I finally walked into the funeral home, the air was thick with soft voices and careful movements, people nodding, hugging, offering quiet condolences, and I could feel the shift as I entered, the way conversations paused just slightly, the way eyes lingered a second too long, and across the room, I saw Ethan standing with his parents, his posture straight, composed, already playing the role he knew so well, and when his eyes found mine, there was no softness there, no shared grief, just something colder, something calculated, and for a moment, I wondered if anyone else could see it. if anyone else could feel the distance that had been growing between us long before today, or if they were all still seeing the version of us we had learned to perform so well. "Elena," his mother said as I approached, her voice polite but distant, her hand resting lightly on my arm like a formality. "You made it." And I nodded, offering a small smile, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes. Because there are some things you learn to hide, some things you learn to carry quietly. And as I stood there, listening to them talk about logistics, about guests, about the schedule, I realized something that should have been obvious a long time ago. They weren't just preparing for a funeral. They were preparing for something else, something I hadn't been told, something I wasn't supposed to see until it was too late. And that was the moment I knew, without a doubt, that what happened later that afternoon at the reception wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't grief making people act out of character. It was planned, carefully and deliberately. And the only question left was how much of it had already been decided without me. When I was 8 years old, I learned that silence could feel louder than shouting. And it happened in our small kitchen on a Tuesday night when my father placed 2 plates on the table, one with a full portion of chicken and vegetables, and the other with barely anything at all. And I remember asking, "Dad, is that mine?" while pointing to the smaller plate, and he looked at me with a tired smile and said, "You always say you are not that hungry, Elena," even though I had never said that, not once. And across from me, my stepbrother Daniel shrugged and dug into his food without looking up, and my stepmother added softly, "You should not be wasteful," like it was a lesson, like it was something I needed to learn, and I nodded, because nodding was easier than explaining something no one wanted to hear. My father had not always been like that. At least, that is what I told myself growing up, because I remembered a time before my stepmother moved in, before Daniel's toys filled the living room, before my place at the table slowly shifted from center to edge. But memories are strange like that. They blur the edges of things, make them softer than they really were. And by the time I was 10, it felt normal to be the one who cleared the dishes while everyone else stayed seated. Normal to hear my name only when something needed to be done. "Elena, can you grab that? Elena, clean this up. Elena, be helpful." And I would answer every time, "Okay." Because that was the role I understood. The one that kept things calm. The one that kept me included, even if only barely. There was a birthday. I think I was 12, when my father promised to come to my school play, and I waited backstage in a borrowed costume that smelled faintly like dust and perfume. Peeking through the curtain at the rows of folding chairs, filling up with parents holding cameras and flowers, and when the lights dimmed and the show started, I kept scanning the crowd for him, for that familiar face that would mean I mattered enough to show up, but his seat stayed empty, and after the final bow, when everyone else ran into their parents' arms, I stood there holding a wilted program, trying to look like I was not waiting for anyone. And later that night, when I got home, he was sitting on the couch watching television with Daniel, and he glanced at me and said, "Oh, was that tonight?" Like it had slipped his mind. Like it was nothing. And my stepmother added, "You know how busy your father is." And I remember nodding again, saying, "It is okay," even though it was not. Even though something small inside me cracked in a way I could not explain at the time, those moments added up quietly over the years, like coins dropped into a jar you never meant to fill. And by the time I was in high school, I had learned how to make myself useful, how to anticipate what people needed before they asked, how to stay out of the way when I was not needed. And I carried that into everything, into friendships, into work, into love, because when you grow up believing your place is conditional, you learn to earn it over and over again. I met Ethan when I was 24, at a small networking event downtown, the kind with cheap wine and polite conversations, and he was charming in a way that felt easy at first, the kind of confidence that makes you feel like you have been seen, really seen, for the first time. And when he asked me what I did, I told him about my work with contracts and financial systems, and he listened, actually listened, asking questions, nodding, making me feel like my words mattered. And later that night, as we stood outside under a flickering streetlight, he said, "You are different." And I laughed, asking, "Different how?" And he smiled. "You pay attention to things other people miss." And that felt like a compliment, like recognition, like something I had been waiting to hear my entire life. The first year we were together, everything felt balanced, or maybe I just wanted it to feel that way, because slowly, almost imperceptibly, the same patterns began to emerge, the same quiet shifts in attention and value, the same way my contributions became expected rather than acknowledged. And I did not notice it right away, not until there was a night, about 3 years into our marriage, when we were at dinner with his parents, and his father asked about Ethan's business, and Ethan launched into a detailed explanation of their growth, their clients, their expansion plans, and I listened, smiling, because I knew every number he was about to mention, every contract he referenced, every strategy he described, because I had helped build it piece by piece from the ground up. And when his mother turned to me and said, "It must be nice to have a husband who takes care of everything," I hesitated for just a second, just long enough to feel the weight of that sentence, and Ethan squeezed my hand under the table and said, "She supports me," like that was the whole story, like that was all I was. And I nodded again, just like I always had, saying, "Of course," because correcting them would have changed the mood, would have made things uncomfortable, would have made me seem difficult. And I had spent too many years learning how to avoid that. Looking back now, I can see how those moments were not isolated, how they were part of a pattern that stretched from that small kitchen in my childhood home all the way to that reception table at my father's funeral. A pattern of being underestimated, overlooked, quietly erased. And the truth is, by the time Ethan slid those papers in front of me, the decision I made in that moment did not start there. It had been forming for years, shaped by every time I chose silence over confrontation, every time I let someone else define my place. And what no one in that room understood, what Ethan did not see when he told me to sign, was that I had already stopped being that version of myself long before that day, and the change had begun in a place he had never even thought to look. The first time I realized something had shifted was not at the funeral, and it was not even in my marriage. It was months before that, on an ordinary Thursday morning, when I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room downtown, watching a group of senior partners argue over numbers they clearly did not understand. And I remember tapping my pen lightly against the table, waiting for someone to notice the mistake that had been sitting there in plain sight for the last 15 minutes. And when no one did, I leaned forward and said, "The projection is off by about 12%, and the room went quiet for a second, one of the partners looking at me like I had just interrupted something important. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I turned my laptop toward him, pointing to the line item. "Your cost assumptions are outdated, and the contract clause you are relying on was amended last quarter." And there was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to make people uncomfortable, before someone else said, "She is right." And just like that, the entire direction of the meeting shifted. Afterward, as people gathered their things, one of the senior attorneys, Mr. Halbrook, stopped beside me and said, "Elena, can you stay for a minute?" And I nodded, watching as the room emptied, the hum of the city faint through the windows, and when it was just the two of us, he leaned against the table and said, "You have been doing this for how long now?" And I shrugged slightly. "About 8 years. And he studied me for a moment before saying, "You see things most people miss." And something about the way he said it felt different from the way Ethan had said it years ago. Less like a compliment and more like an acknowledgement, something grounded in reality instead of perception. And then he added, "We are restructuring a few client accounts, and I want you leading one of them." And for a second, I did not respond, not because I did not understand what he was offering, but because I was not used to being offered anything without having to fight for it quietly behind the scenes. "Are you sure?" I asked, and he gave a small smile. I would not have asked if I was not, and that was the moment something inside me shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would have noticed, but enough that I started to see myself differently, just slightly, just enough to question the version of me I had been carrying for so long. When I told Ethan that night, standing in our kitchen while he scrolled through his phone, I said, "They want me to lead a client account." And he glanced up briefly, nodding, "That is good," before returning his attention to the screen. And I waited, just for a second, for something more, a question, a follow-up, anything that showed he understood what that meant, but it did not come, so I added, "It is a major account, Ethan." And he shrugged. "You have always been good with details." And that was it, the conversation closing as quickly as it had opened, like it did not matter, like I did not matter in that context. And I told myself not to overthink it, that he was just distracted, that it was not intentional, the same way I had told myself so many times before. A week later, we were at dinner with his family again, sitting at their long dining table with perfectly arranged place settings, his mother discussing an upcoming charity event, while his father asked about Ethan's latest business deal. And when there was a brief pause in the conversation, I said, "I have been given a leadership role at work," keeping my voice calm, measured, and his mother smiled politely. "That is nice, dear," before turning back to Ethan and asking, "Have you considered expanding into the West Coast market?" And just like that, the moment passed, unnoticed, unacknowledged, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, that quiet realization that no matter what I did, no matter what I achieved, it would always be filtered through the same lens, the same assumptions, the same hierarchy where I existed somewhere just below relevance. Later that night, as we drove home, I said, "You did not say anything," and Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "About what?" And I looked at him. "About my promotion?" And he exhaled slightly, like the conversation was already exhausting. "Elena, it is not that big of a deal." And there it was again, that subtle dismissal wrapped in calm words, and I turned back to the window, watching the streetlights blur past, realizing that the problem was not that he did not understand, it was that he did not want to, because understanding would mean seeing me differently, and seeing me differently would mean adjusting the dynamic that had always worked in his favor. Over the next few months, things began to change. Not in obvious ways, but in small, measurable shifts. I started taking on more responsibility at work, more visibility, more decisions that carried weight, and with each step forward, I felt a growing distance between who I was becoming and how I was being treated at home, and the contrast was impossible to ignore. In one world, I was trusted, respected, relied on, and in the other, I was still the supportive wife, the quiet presence, the one who handled things behind the scenes without needing recognition. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table reviewing a contract, Ethan walked in and said, "Do you have a minute?" And I looked up. "Of course." And he hesitated for just a second before adding, "I have been thinking about restructuring some of our assets." And something in his tone caught my attention, something calculated, something deliberate. And I closed my laptop slowly, giving him my full attention. "What do you mean?" And he pulled out a chair sitting across from me. "Just making things more efficient," he said, "simplifying ownership, reducing risk." And I nodded, listening. But there was a part of me that had started to notice patterns, to question timing, to connect details that did not quite align. And as he continued explaining, outlining ideas that sounded reasonable on the surface, I felt that quiet sense of awareness building again, the same one I had felt in that conference room, the one that told me there was more beneath what was being said, more that had not been disclosed. And I asked, "Have you already spoken to a lawyer about this?" And for a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, he paused, and then he said, "Not yet," but something in his expression did not match the words. And that was when I realized that whatever was coming next had already been set in motion, and I was only just starting to see the edges of it. It started with small things, the kind that do not look like lies at first, just omissions, just adjustments to the truth that make everything seem smoother on the surface. And I did not question it right away because I had spent years trusting Ethan to handle the parts of our life that were visible while I managed everything behind the scenes. But once I started paying attention, really paying attention, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It was a Tuesday evening when his phone lit up on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, a message preview flashing briefly before the screen went dark. And I was not the kind of person who checked phones. I had never needed to. But something about the timing, the name I did not recognize, made me pause just long enough to notice the tone, the familiarity in just a few words. And when he came back into the room, drying his hands, I asked casually, "Who is Claire?" And he did not hesitate, not even for a second. "Client," he said, reaching for his phone. "We are working on a deal together." And I nodded, because that was a reasonable answer, because it fit into the version of him I had always accepted. But later that night, as he sat across from me at dinner, talking about projections and timelines, I realized he never mentioned her again, not once, like the name had been erased as quickly as it appeared. Over the next few weeks, there were more moments like that, small inconsistencies that did not align, meetings that ran late without explanation, calls taken in another room, conversations that ended abruptly when I walked in, and each time I told myself I was overthinking, that stress was making me see things that were not there. Until one afternoon when I stopped by his office unexpectedly to drop off a folder he had asked for, and the receptionist looked at me with a polite smile and said, "He just stepped out." And I nodded, setting the folder on the desk about to leave when she added, "He and Miss Carter went to lunch." And the name landed heavier than it should have, because I had heard it before, just once, in passing. And I asked, keeping my voice even, "Claire Carter?" And she smiled. "Yes, they have been working closely together." And I thanked her, walking back out into the parking lot with a strange sense of clarity settling over me. Not panic, not anger, just a quiet understanding that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. That night I brought it up again, not accusing, not confrontational, just direct. "You had lunch with Claire today?" And he looked at me for a moment before answering, "Yes, business." And I held his gaze. "Then why did you not mention it?" And he exhaled slightly, leaning back in his chair. "Elena, not everything needs to be a conversation." And there it was, that subtle redirection, that way of making me feel like I was asking too much, like I was creating tension where there should not be any. And I nodded slowly, because arguing would have taken energy I was starting to reserve for something else, something I could not yet fully define. The shift became more visible when his family got involved, when conversations started, including details that I had never been told directly. His mother mentioning casually over dinner, "Ethan says you have been overwhelmed lately." And I blinked, surprised. "I have been busy, yes." And she smiled, that same polite, distant smile. "He is concerned about you." And I glanced at Ethan, who avoided my eyes, focusing instead on his plate, and something tightened in my chest, not because of what she said, but because of how easily the narrative had been shaped, how quickly my reality had been rewritten without my input. A week later, I overheard a conversation that confirmed what I had only suspected. Standing at the top of the stairs while Ethan spoke on the phone in the living room below, his voice low but clear enough in the quiet house. "She will sign," he said, and there was a pause before he added, "She always does." And I felt that sentence settle into me in a way I could not ignore, because it was not just about paperwork, it was about perception, about the role I had played for so long that it had become an expectation, a guarantee he was now relying on. The next morning, I called into work later than usual and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, pulling up documents I had not looked at in months, contracts, agreements, ownership structures, things I had once reviewed in detail, but had gradually stepped back from as Ethan took more visible control. And as I read through them again, line by line, I started to see the adjustments, the subtle changes that had been made over time, clauses rewritten, percentages shifted, and responsibilities reassigned in ways that seemed minor individually but significant when viewed together. And I realized that this had not happened overnight. It had been a process, deliberate and patient, designed to go unnoticed until it was too late. That evening, when Ethan came home, he found me still sitting there, the documents spread out in front of me, and he paused in the doorway, just for a second, before saying, "What are you doing?" And I looked up at him, meeting his eyes, reviewing our agreements, and he walked into the room slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Why?" And I closed the folder in front of me, "Because I want to understand something." And there was a silence that stretched between us, heavy with everything that had not been said, everything that had been hidden in plain sight. And for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression, not guilt, not regret, but calculation, like he was assessing what I knew, what I might have figured out, and how much control he still had over the situation. "Elena," he said finally, his tone measured, "you are overcomplicating this." And I held his gaze steady. "Am I?" And that was the moment everything I had been holding together, every assumption, every quiet acceptance, began to break apart, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt final, irreversible, because I understood now that the man standing in front of me was not just making decisions without me, he was making plans against me, and the only thing left was how far those plans had already gone. The first message came less than 12 hours after that conversation in the kitchen, and I remember it clearly because I had not even left for work yet when my phone lit up on the counter, Ethan's name filling the screen, and I let it ring once before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to hear the tone in his voice before I responded. "Hey," he said, too casually, like nothing had shifted between us, like the night before had been just another conversation. "I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday," and I leaned against the counter, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the marble. "Did we?" I asked, keeping my voice even, and there was a brief pause before he continued. "You are reading too much into things, Elena. I was just talking about optimizing our structure, nothing more." And I closed my eyes for a second, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was listening carefully, measuring the distance between what he was saying and what I already knew. "Then why did you tell someone I would sign?" I asked, and this time the pause was longer, heavier, before he responded. "You overheard something out of context." And I almost smiled at that, because it was such a precise choice of words, designed to shift responsibility away from him and onto me, to make it sound like I was the one misunderstanding reality. Over the next few days, the messages came steadily, not aggressive, not desperate, just persistent in a way that suggested control rather than panic. Texts that said things like, "We should talk when you are calm," and emails outlining proposed adjustments to our financial structure, carefully written, almost clinical, as if this were a business negotiation rather than a marriage unraveling. And each time I read them, I noticed the same pattern, the same underlying assumption that I would eventually agree, that I would fall back into the role he had always relied on. One afternoon, while sitting in my office, I opened an email he had sent just minutes earlier. Subject line simple, draft agreement, and as I scrolled through it, I saw the same clauses I had noticed before, the same shifts in ownership, the same redistribution of assets that would leave me with just enough to seem fair while transferring real control entirely to him. And at the bottom, a note in his tone, polite but firm, "This reflects what we discussed. Let me know if you have any questions." And I stared at that sentence for a long moment before closing the document without replying, because the truth was, I did not have questions. I had answers, just not the kind he was expecting. That evening, his mother called, and I knew it was her before I even picked up, the timing too precise to be coincidence. "Elena," she said, her voice measured, composed. "Ethan mentioned there has been some tension," and I sat at the edge of my bed, the room quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. "That is one way to put it," I replied, and she sighed softly. "You know how important stability is, especially now." And I almost laughed at the word, stability, because it was always used to describe situations where someone else had already decided what was best for you. "I think we define stability differently," I said, and there was a pause before she continued. "He is trying to make responsible decisions, Elena. You should trust him." And I looked down at my hands, steady, calm. "I used to," I answered, and that was enough to end the conversation, her tone shifting slightly, colder, more distant. "I hope you reconsider," she said before hanging up. The next attempt came in the form of something more personal, a handwritten note left on the kitchen counter 2 days later, folded neatly, my name written across the front in Ethan's handwriting, and I opened it slowly, reading the words carefully. "I know this is not how you imagine things, but sometimes we have to make difficult choices for the future," and I traced the edge of the paper with my finger, noticing how carefully each sentence had been constructed, how it acknowledged discomfort without taking responsibility, how it framed the situation as inevitable rather than intentional. And for a moment, I could almost see the version of him who believed this narrative, who saw himself as reasonable, even kind, and that realization was almost more unsettling than the lies themselves. I did not respond to the note, just like I had not responded to the messages, and over time, the tone of his communication began to shift, subtly at first, then more noticeably, from calm persuasion to quiet frustration. A voicemail left late one evening, his voice tighter than before. "Elena, this does not need to be complicated. We can handle this like adults." And I listened to it once, then deleted it, not out of anger, but because I understood now that every attempt he made was not about fixing anything. It was about maintaining control, about guiding the outcome towards something he had already decided, and I was no longer participating in that process. What surprised me most was not his persistence, but how easily everyone around him accepted his version of events, how quickly the narrative spread, colleagues asking if I was taking some time, distant relatives sending polite messages about working things out, all of it based on a story that positioned me as uncertain, emotional, in need of guidance, and I realized then how effective his approach had been, not just in the legal sense, but in shaping perception, in creating a reality where his actions seemed logical and mine seemed reactive. And yet, despite all of it, despite the calls, the emails, the note on the counter, there was something missing from his attempts, something he could not replicate no matter how carefully he chose his words. And that was understanding, because every message assumed I was still the same person I had been before, the one who would eventually agree, the one who would prioritize peace over truth. And that was the part he had not accounted for, the part that had already changed, quietly and completely, long before he realized it. And as the days passed, as his attempts became less frequent, more measured, I found myself in a space I had never experienced before. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of stillness, a separation from the noise of expectation and assumption, where for the first time, I was not reacting to what others wanted from me. And in that stillness, something settled into place, something that made everything that followed not just possible, but inevitable, even if no one else could see it yet. The house felt different after that. Not louder, not emptier, just unfamiliar in a way I could not quite name. Like walking into a place that used to belong to you and realizing something essential had been quietly removed. And I remember standing in the doorway one evening, keys still in my hand, looking at the living room where Ethan used to sit, where his jacket used to be thrown over the back of the chair, where his voice used to fill the space with plans and explanations and small, controlled reassurances. And now there was nothing, just the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I set my bag down on the counter and moved through the house slowly, not searching for anything, just noticing what remained, what had not changed, the stack of unopened mail, the coffee mug I had forgotten to wash that morning, the framed photo of my father on the shelf. And I stopped there, my fingers brushing lightly against the glass. "You always said to pay attention," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper, and for the first time since the funeral, the weight of his absence settled into me in a way that felt undeniable, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady, like a quiet pressure that did not let go. The next day, I went back to his house, the one I had grown up in, now filled with a different kind of silence, the kind that follows when people have already taken what they needed and moved on. And my stepmother met me at the door, her expression polite but guarded. "Elena, I did not expect you," she said, stepping aside to let me in, and I nodded. "I just needed to pick up a few things." And she folded her arms loosely, watching me as I walked past her into the living room, where everything looked almost the same, except for the small details, the missing items, the subtle rearrangements that suggested decisions had already been made without me. "Your father would have wanted things handled efficiently," she said from behind me, and I paused, turning slightly to look at her. "He would have wanted things handled fairly," I replied, and she smiled, thin and measured. "Fairness is a matter of perspective." And I did not respond, because I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life, different words, same meaning, a quiet dismissal disguised as wisdom. Upstairs, in my old room, I opened the closet and found only a few boxes left, most of my belongings already packed away, and I sat on the edge of the bed, running my hand over the worn fabric of the comforter, remembering nights spent staring at the ceiling, trying to understand where I fit in a house that never quite made space for me. And now, sitting there again, years later, I realized that question had followed me into every part of my life, shaping choices I had not even recognized as choices at the time. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket, and when I checked it, there was a message from Ethan, short, direct. "We need to finalize things." And I stared at the screen for a moment before typing a simple response. "Not today." And when I hit send, there was no hesitation, no second guessing, just a quiet certainty that felt unfamiliar but steady, like something I had been building without realizing it. Later that afternoon, I met with a colleague for coffee, not because I needed advice, but because I needed to sit across from someone who saw me clearly, even if only in a professional context. And as we talked about work, about projects and timelines and decisions that carried weight, I noticed how different it felt, how grounded I was in that conversation compared to the ones I had been having at home. And when she asked, "Are you okay?" I paused for a moment before answering, "I think I am starting to be." And she nodded, not pushing further, just accepting the answer for what it was. And that simple exchange stayed with me longer than I expected. That night, back in the house that no longer felt like it belonged to both of us, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of me, not writing anything at first, just staring at the blank page, listening to the quiet. And then, slowly, I began to make a list, not of what I had lost, but of what I knew, facts, details, patterns I had observed over the years, things I had once dismissed or overlooked. And as the list grew, so did a sense of clarity, not about what had happened, but about what needed to happen next. And for the first time since everything began to unravel, I felt something shift, not back to what it was before, but forward into something I had not yet defined, something that did not depend on anyone else's expectations or assumptions. I closed the notebook and rested my hand on top of it, taking a slow breath, and in that moment, the silence in the house no longer felt empty. It felt like space, like room to move, to think, to decide, and as I sat there, I realized that the lowest point had not broken me. It had stripped away everything that was not real, leaving behind something quieter, stronger, something I had not yet fully understood, but was finally ready to face. And somewhere in that realization, I knew that the next step was already waiting, even if no one else could see it yet. I started waking up earlier without setting an alarm, the kind of quiet habit that forms when your mind no longer waits for permission to move forward. And the first morning it happened, I stood in the kitchen at 5:42 a.m., pouring coffee into the same mug I had used for years, watching the light shift slowly across the counter, and instead of checking my phone for messages that used to dictate my mood, I opened my laptop and went back to the list I had started, the one filled with facts, agreements, patterns, things I understood better than anyone had ever realized. At work, I stopped waiting to be asked, stopped second-guessing the instincts I had spent years refining, and one afternoon, when a client hesitated over a decision that would impact their entire quarter, I said, "You are focusing on the wrong risk." And the room went still for a moment, the senior partner glancing at me before nodding slightly. "Go on." And I laid out the structure clearly, each point precise, grounded in data I had already reviewed twice that morning, and when I finished, the client leaned back and said, "That is the first explanation that actually makes sense." And I did not smile, did not downplay it. I simply said, "Then let us move forward." And that was new, not the competence, but the way I allowed it to stand without apology. The days became more structured, not rigid, just intentional. I cleared out the second bedroom and turned it into a workspace that belonged entirely to me. No shared files, no overlapping responsibilities, just a desk, a chair, and the quiet focus I had been missing without realizing it. And when Ethan texted one afternoon, "We need to set a date to finalize everything," I looked at the message for a moment before replying, "Send it to my attorney." And when his response came back almost immediately, "Since when do you have an attorney?" I did not answer. Not because I was avoiding the question, but because the answer was no longer something he was entitled to. A week later, I met with Mr. Halbrook again, sitting across from him in the same glass-walled conference room where everything had started to shift. And he looked at me with a different kind of attention this time, not evaluating, just observing. "You have been taking on more than we discussed," he said, and I nodded. It needed to be done, and he leaned back slightly, considering before saying, "There is a position opening up, something more permanent, more authority. I think you would be a strong candidate," and I met his gaze steadily. "I am not interested in being considered. I am interested in leading," and there was a brief silence before he smiled, not surprised, just acknowledging. "Then we should talk about what that looks like." And as we discussed responsibilities, timelines, expectations, I realized that this was not a sudden transformation. It was the accumulation of everything I had been doing quietly for years, now finally visible because I was no longer stepping back to make space for someone else. Outside of work, the changes were just as subtle, just as deliberate. I stopped attending the dinners I was expected to attend, stopped responding to invitations that were based on obligation rather than connection. And when Ethan's mother called again, her tone sharper this time, "Elena, you cannot just disappear from the family." I listened without interrupting before saying, "I am not disappearing. I am choosing where I am present." And she exhaled, frustrated. "This is not how things are handled." And I replied calmly, "It is how I am handling them." And when the call ended, There was no lingering tension, just a quiet sense of alignment with a version of myself I was still getting to know. One evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing a set of documents, I paused, looking at the details laid out in front of me, the structures, the clauses, the timelines that had once felt overwhelming but now felt familiar, manageable, and I realized that the same skills I had used to support someone else's vision were now fully directed toward my own. And that shift, that redirection of focus, was more powerful than anything I had done before. The world around me had not changed dramatically. The same streets, the same buildings, the same routines, but my place within it had shifted in a way that made everything feel different, more defined, more intentional. And as I closed my laptop that night, the city lights reflecting faintly through the window, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. That rebuilding does not happen in a single moment. It happens in a series of quiet decisions that accumulate over time, each one reinforcing the next, each one moving you further from who you were expected to be and closer to who you actually are. And somewhere in that process, without any announcement or recognition, I had stepped into a position I had always been capable of holding, one that did not rely on validation or permission, one that was entirely my own. And although no one around me had said it out loud yet, I could feel the shift in how I was being seen, in how I was being approached, and more importantly, in how I saw myself. And for the first time, the future did not feel like something I had to navigate carefully around other people's expectations. It felt like something I could shape, deliberately and completely, in ways that had not even been considered before. The first time I saw my name on the door, it did not feel like a moment. It felt like a quiet confirmation of something that had been building long before anyone else noticed, and I stood there for a second longer than necessary, my hand resting lightly against the cool glass, reading the letters slowly. Elena Rivera, Senior Contract Director, and even though it was just a title, just a formal recognition of responsibilities I had already been carrying, it held a weight that was different from anything I had experienced before, not because it changed who I was, but because it made it visible in a way that could no longer be ignored. Inside the office, everything was still new. The desk clean, the files neatly organized, the faint scent of fresh paint lingering in the air. And when I set my bag down and adjusted the nameplate on the desk, aligning it carefully, I realized how intentional every detail felt, how different it was from the spaces I had occupied before, where I had always left room for someone else to take the lead, and now there was no one else, no shadow to stand behind, no role to defer to. Later that morning, I walked into a meeting with a group of clients who had flown in from out of state, their expectations clear, their questions direct, and as I took my seat at the head of the table, one of them glanced at the others before asking, "You are leading this?" And I met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." And there was a brief pause before he nodded. "Good, we need clarity." And I opened the file in front of me, laying out the structure of the agreement with precision, each point deliberate, each explanation grounded in details I had already reviewed multiple times. And as the conversation progressed, I could feel the shift in the room, the subtle change in how they responded, not questioning my position, but relying on it. And when one of them said, "That works," I simply replied, "Then we will proceed," without the need to soften it or justify it, because confidence, I was learning, it did not need to announce itself. It simply existed in the absence of doubt. After the meeting, as people gathered their things, Mr. Prasidiv Klespri said. Halbrook stepped beside me, his tone measured. "You handled that well," and I nodded. It was straightforward, and he smiled slightly. "It rarely is, but you make it look that way." And I did not respond immediately, not because I disagreed, but because I understood now that the work I had been doing for years had always been this level. It had just not been acknowledged in the same way. The changes extended beyond the office, small but meaningful shifts in how I moved through the world, how I presented myself, not in appearance alone, but in posture, in tone, in the way I occupied space without hesitation. And one afternoon, as I stood in line at a coffee shop near the office, the barista glanced at my badge, clipped neatly to my jacket, and said, "Long day?" And I smiled slightly. "Productive," and she handed me my coffee with a nod. "Looks like you are doing something important," and I almost laughed, not because it was inaccurate, but because for so long, what I did had been important without anyone seeing it. And now, Even small interactions reflected a shift that was no longer internal. The first time Ethan saw the change was unplanned. A brief moment in a hallway outside a conference room where our paths crossed unexpectedly, and he stopped mid-step, his eyes moving from my face to the badge on my jacket, then back again. "Elena," he said, his tone uncertain in a way I had never heard before, and I nodded. "Ethan," keeping my voice steady, neutral, and he gestured slightly. "I did not know you had taken on this role." And I adjusted the folder in my hands. "There are a lot of things you did not know." And for a moment, he looked like he was about to respond, to reassert something familiar. But instead, he simply said, "We should talk," and I held his gaze briefly before answering, "You can speak to my attorney." And then I walked past him, not quickly, not dismissively, just with the same steady pace I had maintained all day, leaving him standing there with a version of me he had never accounted for. That evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing the final details of a contract that would close the following week, I noticed the date in the corner of the document, the timeline aligning in a way that felt almost intentional, and I paused, leaning back slightly, allowing myself a moment to connect the threads, the past, the decisions, the quiet shifts that had brought me to this point. And for the first time, the memory of the reception, the papers on the table, the weight of that moment, it did not feel overwhelming. It felt like a turning point, a line that separated who I had been from who I had become, and as I closed the file and turned off the light, I knew that the next time I saw those papers, the next time that moment replayed in real time, it would not unfold the way anyone expected, because everything that had changed since then had been leading back to that exact point where the past and present would meet, and this time, I would be the one who understood what was actually happening. The room felt smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way silence pressed closer against the walls, as if every person inside was holding their breath at the same time, and I stood just inside the doorway of the reception hall, the soft murmur of voices blending with the faint clink of porcelain cups against saucers, the scent of coffee and lilies still lingering in the air, unchanged, like time had paused here while everything else moved forward. Ethan was already there, standing near the long table at the center of the room, his posture composed, controlled, the same way it had always been when he believed he was about to finalize something, and beside him, Claire shifted slightly, her hand resting lightly against his arm, her expression calm but observant, like she was waiting for a moment she had already rehearsed in her mind. I walked in without hesitation, my steps measured, the sound of my heels against the polished floor just loud enough to draw attention without demanding it, and I could feel the subtle shift as conversations slowed, as people turned, as recognition settled into their expressions, not of who I had been, but of something they could not quite define yet. "Elena," my aunt said softly from across the room, her voice carrying a note of concern, and I nodded briefly, offering a small acknowledgement before continuing forward, because stopping would have changed the pace, and the pace mattered now, more than anything. Ethan noticed me as I approached, his eyes narrowing slightly in a way that suggested calculation rather than surprise, and he straightened just enough to signal readiness. "You made it," he said, his tone even, almost neutral, as if this were a scheduled meeting rather than a moment that had been building for weeks. And I met his gaze without responding immediately, allowing the silence to sit between us for a second longer than was comfortable, before saying, "You said this needed to be finalized." And he nodded once, reaching for the folder on the table, the same folder, the same clean stack of papers, untouched since the last time I had seen them. "It does," he replied, sliding it slightly closer to me, the movement deliberate, practiced, and I noticed how his hand lingered on the edge for just a fraction of a second, as if reinforcing control over something that had already been decided in his mind. Around us, the room had grown quieter, conversations fading into the background as attention shifted fully to the table, to the papers, to the unspoken understanding that something significant was about to happen, and I could see the familiar expressions forming: expectation, curiosity, a subtle certainty that this moment would unfold the way it always had, that I would respond the way I always did. "We have made some adjustments," Ethan continued, his voice steady, professional. "Nothing that changes the overall structure, just clarifying ownership and responsibilities, And I glanced down at the documents, not reading them yet, just acknowledging their presence, the weight of them, the assumption they carried. "Of course," I said quietly, and his mother, standing just behind him, added, "This is the best outcome for everyone," her tone firm, reassuring, as if the conclusion had already been agreed upon. And I looked up briefly, meeting her eyes. "Everyone?" I asked, and there was a slight pause, a flicker of something that passed quickly before she responded, "For the family," and I nodded once, accepting the answer without comment, because clarification was not the point anymore. Ethan reached for the pen next, placing it carefully on top of the papers, aligning it with the margin, a small, precise gesture that mirrored the way he had always approached decisions, controlled, calculated, expecting compliance. "We can take care of this now," he said, and I could hear the underlying assumption in his voice, the expectation that this was simply the final step in a process that had already been completed without me. And I picked up the pen slowly, feeling its weight between my fingers, noticing how steady my hand was, how different it felt from the last time, not because the situation had changed, but because I had. "Before you sign," Ethan added, his tone shifting slightly, almost softer, "I want to make sure we are on the same page." And I looked at him waiting, and he continued, "This is clean, straightforward, it protects both of us, there is no reason to complicate it." And for a moment, I saw the version of him that believed this narrative, that believed control equaled clarity, that believed simplicity meant fairness, and I almost said something, almost explained, almost corrected, but instead I just nodded once. "I understand," because understanding was not the issue. The room remained still, the air heavy with anticipation, and I could feel the weight of every gaze, every assumption, every expectation pressing toward this single moment, this single action that would confirm what they all believed to be true. And as I lowered my eyes to the page, positioning the pen at the line where my name was printed, I allowed myself one final pause, one final breath, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, because timing mattered, and this was the moment where everything they thought they knew would either hold or collapse. And none of them, not Ethan, not his family, not anyone in that room, understood yet that what I was about to do had already been decided long before I walked through that door, long before this meeting was arranged, long before they believed they had control over the outcome. And as the tip of the pen hovered just above the paper, I realized that the only thing left was for them to see it. The pen touched the paper, and for a moment, nothing changed. No reaction, no interruption, just the faint scratch of ink against the page as I signed my name exactly where they expected me to. Clean. Precisi. Final. And I could feel the subtle release in the room, the quiet shift in posture, the almost invisible exhale as everything aligned with the version of events they had already accepted as truth. Ethan's hand moved first, reaching for the documents as soon as I finished, his fingers sliding the pages back toward him with a controlled sense of completion, like closing a deal that had been inevitable, and he gave a small nod, almost to himself. "Thank you," he said, not looking at me, already turning slightly toward Claire as if the moment had passed, as if I had simply fulfilled my role in a process he had orchestrated. His mother stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. This was the right decision, and I glanced at her briefly, holding her gaze just long enough for the words to settle before replying, "It was a decision." And she paused, something in my tone registering differently than expected, but she did not respond. Not yet. Ethan gathered the papers into a neat stack, tapping them lightly against the table to align the edges, a habit I had seen 100 times before, and as he did, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin folder of my own, placing it calmly on the table beside his, not sliding it forward, not drawing attention, just setting it there, present, visible. He noticed it immediately, his hand pausing mid-motion, eyes shifting briefly to the folder before returning to me. "What is that?" he asked. His tone still controlled but edged now with something less certain, and I rested my hand lightly on the cover. "Documentation," I said simply, and there was a slight movement behind him as Claire adjusted her stance, her attention sharpening. Ethan frowned slightly. "For what?" And I met his gaze evenly. "For the same process you just completed." And the room seemed to still again, not with anticipation this time, but with confusion, the kind that forms when a narrative begins to fracture. His mother stepped forward, her voice tightening. "Elena, What are you talking about? And I opened the folder slowly, not rushing, not dramatizing, just turning the first page so that the header was visible, the formal language clear and unmistakable, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, reading the top line before his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, a subtle recalibration as he processed what he was seeing. "You signed this," he said, his voice lower now, less certain, and I nodded. 2 hours before the service. And there was a pause, a longer one this time, the kind that stretches as understanding begins to form but has not fully settled yet. Claire spoke next, her tone measured but sharper than before. "What is it?" And Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes moving across the page, scanning details he had not expected to exist. And I watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with a steady awareness of the moment unfolding exactly as it needed to. "It is a transfer agreement," he said finally, his voice quieter, and I added, "among other things," turning another page, revealing additional documents, each one aligned, each one signed, each one carrying weight that extended beyond what he had assumed was being finalized here today. His mother stepped closer again, her composure beginning to fracture at the edges. "Transfer of what?" she asked, and I looked at her, answering without hesitation. "Control." And the words settled into the room with a clarity that did not require emphasis. Ethan shook his head slightly, as if recalibrating. "That is not possible," he said, more to himself than to me. And I tilted my head just enough to acknowledge the statement without agreeing. "It is already executed," I replied. And he looked up at me then, really looked, not at the version of me he had relied on, but at the one standing in front of him now, and for the first time, there was no assumption in his expression, no certainty, just a growing realization that something fundamental had shifted beyond his control. "You cannot just do that," Claire said, her voice tighter now, stepping forward as if proximity might change the outcome, and I met her gaze briefly. "It has already been done." And then I returned my attention to Ethan, because this was not about her. Not really, it never had been. He ran a hand through his hair, a small, uncharacteristic break in his composure. "When?" he asked, and I answered simply, "Before you scheduled this." And there it was. The point where everything they believed to be in motion collided with something that had already been completed, already finalized, already beyond revision. The room felt different now, not smaller, but sharper, every detail more defined, every reaction more visible. And I could see the moment of realization moving through each of them at a different pace, some faster, some slower, but all reaching the same conclusion eventually, that the version of events they had accepted was incomplete, that the outcome they had anticipated was no longer aligned with reality. Ethan looked down at the papers in his hand, then at the ones on the table, then back at me. And in that sequence, I saw the shift fully settle, not just confusion, but recognition, the understanding that he had miscalculated something fundamental, not in the documents, not in the process, but in me, and that realization landed heavier than anything else in the room, because it was not something he could adjust, not something he could renegotiate. And as the silence stretched, no one speaking, no one moving, the weight of that understanding became undeniable, settling into the space between us in a way that left no room for interpretation, only the quiet shock of what had just been revealed. No one spoke at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because no one seemed certain where to begin, and I stood there with my hand resting lightly on the folder, watching the realization move through the room in uneven waves, Ethan still holding the papers he had expected to define everything, his grip tighter now, less controlled, while his mother looked between us, her expression shifting from certainty to something closer to disbelief. "This does not make sense," she said finally, her voice sharper than before, directed at me but carrying an edge of urgency that had not been there earlier, and I met her gaze calmly. "It does," I replied. "You just were not given all the information," and that seemed to land differently, not as a challenge, but as a statement that could not be easily dismissed. Ethan exhaled slowly, placing his papers back on the table, his movements more deliberate now, as if recalculating each step. "You went behind my back," he said, his tone controlled but strained, and I tilted my head slightly, considering the phrasing before answering. "I made decisions based on the information I had." And he shook his head, a small, restrained motion. "You should have talked to me." And I held his gaze steady. I did, many times. And there was a brief pause, a flicker of something unspoken passing between us. The weight of conversations that had never fully happened, questions that had been redirected or dismissed. Claire stepped forward then, her posture more rigid than before, her voice carefully measured. "This affects more than just the two of you," and I looked at her, acknowledging the statement without yielding to it. "Yes," I said, "that is why it was handled properly." And her expression tightened slightly, not anger exactly, but something close to it, the discomfort of a situation that was no longer aligned with her expectations. "Handled properly?" Ethan's mother repeated, her voice rising just enough to draw attention again. "You call this proper?" And I turned to her fully, keeping my tone even. "It was reviewed, documented, and executed through the appropriate channels." And she opened her mouth as if to respond, then stopped, the words not forming as easily as before, because the language I was using did not leave room for interpretation, only for acknowledgement. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "What exactly have you done?" he asked. And I glanced down at the documents briefly before answering. "I clarified ownership, restructured control, and secured the assets that were originally tied to my work," and the room seemed to absorb that in silence, each word carrying a precision that was difficult to argue against without fully understanding it. "Your work?" he repeated, and there was something different in his tone now, not disbelief, but a quiet recognition of something he had not fully considered before, and I nodded once. "Yes." And for a moment, that was all that needed to be said. His mother shook her head again, more firmly this time. "This is not how families operate," she insisted, and I met her gaze without hesitation. "That depends on the family," and the simplicity of the response seemed to unsettle her more than any explanation would have, because it did not engage with the expectation she was trying to impose. There was movement around us then, subtle but noticeable, people shifting, stepping back slightly, creating space not out of courtesy, but out of uncertainty, as if the dynamic in the room had changed in a way they did not yet understand how to navigate. Ethan straightened, his expression more controlled again, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, more cautious. "This is not over," he said, and I nodded, acknowledging the statement without reacting to it. "No," I replied, "it is not." And that seemed to be the only point we both agreed on. He looked at me for a moment longer, searching for something, perhaps the version of me he had expected to see, the one who would hesitate, who would soften, who would step back to restore balance. But that version was not there, not anymore. And I could see the realization settle in again, more fully this time, not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual understanding of a shift that had already taken place. "We will review this," he said finally, his voice steadier now, returning to the language he understood, the framework he relied on, and I inclined my head slightly. "You should," because that was all that remained to be done. His mother turned away first, her movements sharper, less composed, while Claire lingered for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the documents before she stepped back as well, and the room began to fill with sound again, quiet conversations resuming, but different now, less certain, more cautious, as if everyone was recalibrating what they had just witnessed. I gathered my folder slowly, closing it with a soft, deliberate motion, and as I did, I felt the weight of the moment settle into something quieter. Less about confrontation and more about consequence, not immediate, not fully visible yet, but present in a way that would continue to unfold beyond this room. Ethan did not move to stop me as I stepped back from the table. His attention still divided between the documents and the realization they represented, and for a brief moment, our eyes met again, not with hostility, not even with anger, but with an understanding that something fundamental had changed between us, something that could not be reversed or negotiated away. I turned then, moving toward the door with the same steady pace I had maintained when I entered, the room parting slightly to allow space, and as I stepped out into the hallway, the air felt different. Lighter in a way that was difficult to define, not because everything had been resolved, but because it had finally been acknowledged, and yet, even in that clarity, there was something unresolved lingering beneath the surface. Not a question exactly, but a recognition that what had begun here was not the end of anything, but the continuation of something that would take time to fully understand. The days after that room felt quieter, Not in the way silence used to press in on me, but in the way space opens when something heavy has finally been set down. And I remember the first morning I woke up without that tightness in my chest, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the early light stretch across the city like it had been doing all along, unchanged, patient, waiting for me to notice it differently. Nothing in my life had suddenly become perfect. There were still emails to answer, legal details to finalize, conversations that remained unfinished, but everything felt clearer, like the fog that had been sitting just beneath the surface for years had finally lifted, and for the first time, I was not navigating around someone else's expectations. I was moving forward on my own terms, even if that path was still forming with each step I took. At work, the rhythm continued, steady and grounded. My name on the door no longer something I paused to read, but something I carried without needing to prove it. And one afternoon, as I walked past the glass wall of a conference room and caught my reflection briefly, I noticed something subtle but undeniable. Not a change in appearance, but in presence. The way I stood, the way I held myself, the absence of hesitation in small movements that once required effort. And it was in that moment I understood that growth does not always announce itself. Sometimes it reveals itself quietly, in the way you no longer shrink to fit spaces that were never meant to hold you. Ethan's name appeared on my phone a few more times in the weeks that followed, shorter messages now, more measured, less certain, and eventually, they stopped, not with a final conversation or resolution, but with a kind of mutual understanding that whatever existed between us had already reached its natural conclusion, and I did not feel the need to respond, not out of resentment, but because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to fix, only something to move beyond. My father's house was eventually sold, the process handled through proper channels, documented, finalized, the same way everything else had been. And the last time I walked through those rooms, I paused in the doorway of what used to be my bedroom, running my hand lightly along the wall, not with sadness, but with recognition, understanding now that the space had never truly defined me, only reflected the way I had once seen myself. And as I turned to leave, I did not look back, not because I was closing a door, but because I no longer needed to measure my worth by what I was leaving behind. If there is one thing I have learned through all of this, it is that people will often show you who they believe you are, not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent expectations. And if you are not careful, you will start to believe them, shaping yourself around those expectations until you forget that you ever had a choice. But the truth is, you always do. Even if it does not feel like it in the moment, even if it requires you to sit with discomfort, to question what you have accepted for years, to trust a quiet instinct that tells you something is not right even when everything on the surface looks stable. And if you are listening to this right now, feeling like you are being asked to become smaller, quieter, easier to manage just to keep the peace, I want you to know that you are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to protect what you have built, not just financially, but emotionally, mentally, in every way that defines who you are, because self-respect is not something you negotiate. It is something you recognize and then refuse to compromise. I am not saying it is easy. It is not. There will be moments when the silence feels heavy again, when the absence of familiar patterns leaves you unsure of what comes next. But those moments are not emptiness. They are space. And in that space, you get to decide what stays, what goes, and who you become moving forward. And sometimes, if you are quiet enough to listen, that guidance comes from somewhere deeper, whether you call it intuition, faith, or something else entirely. A sense that you are being led towards something more aligned with who you are meant to be, even if you cannot fully see it yet. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening without judgment, for allowing these moments to exist in a way that feels shared rather than isolated, because the truth is, none of us moves through these experiences alone, even when it feels that way. And if anything in this story has reflected something in your own life, I hope it reminds you that clarity comes, not all at once, but in pieces, and each piece matters. My name is Elena Rivera. I am 34 years old, and the lesson I carry forward from all of this is simple. You do not need to prove your value to people who benefit from underestimating you. You only need to recognize it for yourself. And if you feel there are more stories like this waiting to be told, moments where quiet strength changes everything in ways no one expects, then there is more ahead for you to explore, more perspectives, more journeys that might feel familiar in ways you did not anticipate. And you may find that the next story you hear connects to something within you just as deeply, offering a different piece of understanding, a different way forward, if you choose to keep listening.